Welcome everyone to today's session. This is the third in a series of online events that we're following up on our original Changemakers event held at the end of February on governance. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I broadcast today, the Wadawurrung people. I acknowledge their continuing connection to land, sea and skies and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Stacie Bobele and I'm working for Regional Arts Victoria in a role delivering the Making Change strategy across the South Coast, Greater Geelong, Golden Plains and Colac-Otway region of Victoria. The Making Change project aims to bring knowledge, opportunity and connection to creatives across the region with a view to building sustainability across all creative industry subsectors. Last time we spoke with Jo Porter, who's our guest today. Jo is the CEO of Regional Arts Victoria, and Jo has a particular expertise in governance. And last time we spoke with Jo, we focused on the importance of strategic thinking and taking that step back to really reflect on your vision and purpose, identifying who you are, why you exist, who for, and how this should shape the decisions you make around governance structure, but most importantly, the people that you engage to bring along on the journey. So in this session, we'll look at the other half of governance, which is compliance. And today we'll expand upon the different types of structures that are available, who they'd be useful for, the pros and cons of each of those, and important protections that are afforded through each of those to enable creative risk-taking. So welcome, Jo.
Thanks, Stacie.
Let's start with the, I guess, a description of all the different kinds of, I guess, models that you can choose from.
Okay.
We'll start with the standard, which seems to be the preferred model for a lot of organisations at the moment, is the incorporated association and not-for-profit.
Yeah, so I guess taking one little step back is choosing what kind of person you are and what kind of work you want to do. You might want to work with a group of people. That's what a lot of people want to do. And so forming a company allows you to work within that company in a structure that is described as, or a corporate structure is described as setting up a natural person. So effectively what that setting up a company does is create an entity that can sue and be sued. It can incur debts. It can make commitments, just like it was an actual person, only provided that the people running it are acting in the company's best interests. That company is a sort of protection for risk taking, as you indicated, so that again, as long as they're acting legally and appropriately when making decisions on behalf of the company is responsible for the debts. The company is responsible for the contractual obligations and so on, rather than the individuals who might have set up that company. Making sense so far?
Yes.
Excellent.
So far.
Excellent. So I guess if you're going to say you're a little theatre company or you're an artist-run initiative that you want to work with some other people, you can form a company by incorporating an association. And I guess this came out of the community sports environment, where a netball club, a football club, a cricket club, a Rotary, I don't think it's a Rotary club, but say you and your friends wanted to raise some money for a cause, you can set up an incorporated association, which is a registered entity, and it is required to put all the profits back into the association's activities. So just like you think of your football, netball club, I assume the surf club, you have an entity that's registered that raises money, but it's not paying the members of the surf club or the members of the netball club, at the end of the day, the money goes back into the kitty in order to buy new equipment or whatever it is.
Yep. But that entity can employ someone. That's a
correct.
important distinction.
It certainly can, and it must also has to have at least 5 members. I'm not 100% sure what the limit on the number of members. It's quite large, but it has to have 5 members, and so that's quite often also a management committee. Those 5 members are limited in their liability. So, for example, if someone does sue the company protects them to the limit of their membership fee, which might be $10 a year or something like that. And those 5 people might become 50 people who in turn elect 5 people to act as a management committee and keep an eye on how the organisation's travelling, make sure that it's paying its GST if it needs to, all of those sorts of things that we'll probably come to a bit later in terms of compliance. But as I said, that if you think about the way that most of us sort of have a gut feeling of how a sports club works, that's what an incorporated association is in terms of members.
Right. And so you mentioned you had a minimum of 5 members. So if you can't get 5 people together,
you can't have an association.
Right, okay.
That's a requirement.
Right. And do they have to be financial members, or can you make it so that they're not? There's some other commitment.
They do need to be financial members, but it can be a very modest, $2, $5, $10. It doesn't have to be. Certainly doesn't have to be a lot of money. There's a way of registering a cooperative, which is it's a slightly different thing, and that might actually be what people who really don't want a financial transaction as part of their entity. And I've got some links I can share with you later about the difference between co-ops and incorporated association. But the key difference is that a co-op can actually profit. It can distribute money back to the members, but also the members have to be involved in the management of the co-op. You can't delegate your management. You have to be involved in the day-to-day.
Right. Okay.
So it's a really very democratically based, kind of as we would imagine a co-op, that it needs to be collectively managed as a very flat organisation. So it's not for everybody.
Right. Yeah, I don't think cooperatives get considered all that often, maybe because of that need for democracy. I don't know.
It can be pretty complicated, and I would imagine that the incorporated association is more attractive because it's much more cut and dried. I think the cooperative or collective can have quite specific governance needs, because of the need for involvement by all of the people who belong to it.
Right.
One advantage is that it doesn't have to be not-for-profit according to the framework of the regulatory environment, because I think what we get to very quickly is what the reporting requirements for these kinds of companies might be. And so when you're thinking about, or who's letting you do whatever, or who's saying you have to have 5 members or whatever, that's the Corporations Act. It's the Companies Act for Australia. And then also there are subsidiary or dovetailing acts in each state. And they have all the rules and regulations for what you have to do if you're a company, and set out what the different kinds of requirements are depending on what kind of company you are.
Right.
So just, I suppose, whipping through the companies that most of the people watching this probably won't opt to do is form a proprietary limited company, which is what a BHP is or whatever. And that instead of members has shareholders, and those shareholders can gather up more and more and more and more and more shares, for example, and have a much greater say in the way that the organisation makes decisions, whereas an incorporated association, it has a sort of one person, one vote kind of decision making. You can't accumulate shares and say, well, I have 60% of the board seats, or I have 60% of the decision making power. That's quite kind of a different model, and much more it's aligned with the way that public companies are traded on the stock, or listed on the stock exchange.
And so all of that, how is it, like, is that reviewed when you I say, like, all of that you were just talking about in terms of like financial compliance, that is done at tax time, or you're required to do auditing yourself, or like who keep
it? As always, it depends.
Right. Maybe we won't go down that path.
If you're a proprietary limited company and you're listed on the Australian Stock Exchange or whatever, you actually have to file your accounts very regularly. If one of your assets, say if you're a mining company, if you have to, if there's an accident, or if there's a change in the value of one of the mines because of the way that that particular mineral is trading, then you have to advise the stock exchange so that all of the investors, all of the shareholders have a very transparent relationship. You have an annual general meeting that you might get activist shareholders and other shareholders showing up to, the media show up to, all of that kind of thing. So the structure of an incorporated association recognises the much more, always much more responsive to the needs of a community group. So that would require an annual report. So once, the committee should be looking at the finances regularly, but in terms of having to report to a government body, there's a different government body for not-for-profits.
Right.
Which is the Australian ACNC, Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, rather than the Australian Securities and Investment Commission.
Right.
Yeah, so that there's that sort of for-profit, and then the not-for-profit sector or the charity sector sort of goes in a different direction, specifically so that the compliance level is not as onerous, because it recognises that the resources are not as great in that. But you still have to put your annual report, you still have to show what you've been doing, get an auditor to look at your accounts and certify that you're a going concern. And that's the big requirement for any company, that if you're not a going concern, then you can't continue to trade, because it means that the company's debts can't be paid, which kind of undermines that whole idea of the protection that a company would give you, that if you know, if you, naughty Stacie, are a member of a company and there's no money in the bank, you can't say, we're going to put on a show and sell tickets and everything, because there's no particular guarantee that the debts can be paid, and that's called trading while insolvent, and you're not allowed to do that.
Right. And so that would be the case for that's small business too, is it?
Yeah, that's for any kind of business, but particular, there is a really particular, I suppose, hurdle that every year you need to confirm that that's the case for the company, but also every week, a director is acting very badly and possibly illegally if they know that they can't pay their debts.
Yeah. So if you're like now moved on to small business, this is probably more if you're, again, not looking to work with a large group of people, you're wanting to set up a creative business or even a commercial gallery, say. What does that cut you out of? Or like, what would that, like, the benefits of that are obviously that, you're making money for the company, which is obviously owned by you. You're not really accountable to anybody other than your partners. Is that right? Or because you wouldn't necessarily have to have shareholders?
necessarily. No, you don't need to have shareholders. You can have a limited company, which is effectively a different kind of registration. But you, instead of, for example, being listed on the stock exchange and trading in the shares, you have a privately owned situation where you have agreements, or people can buy chunks of your shareholdings or your value of the company. So, for example, if you were going to, as you said, a commercial art gallery, you might say have an arrangement that 3 people set up a company and they own it a third, but then someone wants to get out of the company. They might sell their third to someone else, or they might sell it to one of the other company members, and then they would have 2/3 a third or something arrangement, so that they wouldn't necessarily sort of have that one person, one vote kind of situation in the company. There's that sort of, I suppose, that the company has value to outsiders to buy because it's not a not-for-profit. It doesn't just distribute the money to the members, and that's more likely to be some kind of company limited by a guarantee, or just a limited liability company, and that doesn't have any restriction on whether it has to be not-for-profit or otherwise. That's, you know, much more flexibility, and with that flexibility comes a little bit more compliance requirements. So that kind of company also needs to report to the ASIC, which is the same as the big companies report to,
right?
For their, just to make sure they're operating in a proper fashion.
So pros, you're making all your own money, but cons are there's a lot more reporting that's required.
Yeah, and it's not a massive amount, but it is you're held to a higher standard on the expectation that your expertise is also higher, and you're also mostly expected to pay tax. Whereas if you're an incorporated association and the money's going back into the company, typically a company like that would be able to be exempt from income tax.
Right. Okay. That's interesting to know.
It's good to know.
Yeah. And which brings us down to, or not down to, but to sole trader. Like, so where and how does that sit alongside everything?
I guess a sole trader is typically, you know, your individual who has an ABN and is effectively running their business by themselves or with some others. You know, they can have employees, but effectively it's that you're running it for your own purpose and that you're conducting the operations. So whereas with any of the companies, you might be a member of an unincorporated association, you might be a shareholder, you might have shares in a limited liability company or a proprietary limited company. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're hands-on doing the work. It means someone else might be running the day-to-day. Whereas if you're a sole trader, you're the person who's making the artwork, painting the house, whatever that organisation does, that the services are being provided by you rather than by someone else in the company.
Yeah. And that is a model that's adopted a lot by, I guess, individual artists and other creatives like designers who are doing contract work, because that is, I guess, an easier way of going about things as an individual.
Yep. Exactly. And so it's not difficult to apply for an ABN, and you do need to have an ABN for that purpose. And I suppose the disadvantage is that you're personally liable for all of the debts of you. So you haven't created that natural person who is a shelter for the directors in terms of risk taking. So very much it's what's written on the packet. You're in there by yourself.
Yeah. Which probably brings along with it a lot of extra insurances.
Yeah, different kinds of insurance. So, for example, company might have public liability insurance, so that if the proverbial brick off the building falls on someone's head, the company itself is protected. So if that person who got hit on the head sues the company is protected by that insurance. And then that it's possible for the directors of the company, and in the case of the incorporated association, the management committee, who are often called board members, or a board instead of a committee, they can get directors and officers insurance, so that as long as they've made their decision in an accountable way, there's legal terms around it, but basically as long as they've paid attention to the decisions and that a reasonable person would have made a similar decision, they are also individually protected from being sued as individuals by someone, so that the person who got hit by the brick can only sue the company, or if they do get individually sued, there's insurance that will cover that. So whereas a sole trader might have a professional indemnity kind of insurance, where so for example, if you're an accountant and you're a sole trader, you might have to have professional indemnity insurance against giving someone financial advice that is wrong, or I know that individual doctors and lawyers and sort of people in professional practice have quite high insurance. So and I know that comes up for artists who are doing some teaching as well on the side, that they might have to have some kind of professional liability in relation to someone getting injured while they're learning to dance, or whatever that is, whatever they're up to.
Yeah, which sits separately to public liability. So I think a lot of people are very familiar with needing to have public liability, particularly if you're involved in pulling together an event or an exhibition, or even if you're working with other people and they're coming to your home or studio, you'll still need to have that public liability insurance a lot of the time. Well, it's wise too, it's best practice. But professional liability doesn't often get thought about unless someone specifically asks for it as part of a contract.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
but the professional liability is probably good, like if you're doing I don't know, say a writing project potentially as well, like it's because it's in the services you're providing, isn't it? That's the distinction.
Yeah, and quite often in the advice that you're giving. So for example, I'm pretty sure you can't insure against slandering somebody, so you couldn't insure for that if you're a writer. But if you were a dance teacher, you could insure against saying to someone, as long as it was a reasonable request, saying do this stretch, they injure themselves doing so, you'll probably have some kind of conversation about how responsibly you acted in asking them to do that stretch. But that's the sort of purpose of that professional liability. And usually you have to tick a box that you are not giving people financial advice because that's a whole other world.
So with sole trader, if you did become a sole trader, and like we'll go down the funding route now, because there are quite a few funding organisations now who look at sole traders specifically who are creatives as being eligible for funding nowadays. So that isn't automatically locking you out of like all of but there is a move towards that.
So a government, so like Creative Victoria would have a round that's for individuals, and I think Creative Australia has a round, and maybe Creative Victoria does too, but they differentiate between individuals and groups and organisations. Sorry to use the rabbit ears, but it is they differentiate that, and so that's really allowing for the fact that it might be an individual artist who's got an ABN, and I think you do have to have an ABN, but they're also allowing in there the group that is behaving more like a collective and comes together to make a work and then moves apart again. So one person has to receive the money usually, but it is expressing the kind of artistic desire or the artistic goals of a little group of people rather, or an individual, and then separately an organisation would be a company.
So say you were like a small collective, like there's three of you and you have a specific idea for a project. One of you happens to be a sole trader. Could you then apply for a grant, or would it be better to go and be auspiced?
That depends on how much administration you want to do. I think an auspice organisation is an organisation that will put its name forward as the grant applicant, and likely you as the artist are going to have to have written the application, but that the auspicor will put in the application, receive the money, and then do all the contracting that you want them to do. So if you, Stacie, applied for $20,000 to do an art project, a very small art project, you would then give them a budget, the auspicing organisation a budget, and say, I want you to pay the following people, or I want you to take out the following insurances, and then the auspicing organisation will effectively be like your administrator.
Right, yeah.
And they'll help you with all the financial reporting and so on, but they're not your not your producer, so that you need to work with them to provide them with a lot of information. But they're certainly doing things like taking tax out and submitting it to the Australian Tax Office, making sure that superannuation's paid and submitted, and making sure that you're working within your budget. So it's certainly a pretty great option for someone who's doing projects as a one-off artist who's not super keen on doing the day-to-day administration. Most auspice organisations take like 5 to 10% of the grant as their payment, and some of them take up to 20%, which I would recommend shopping around if that's what you're being asked for. That's probably too much. But certainly, at the 5% range, particularly of a small grant, you're getting a lot of value for money in terms of making sure that you're getting all that back end work done if you don't know how to do it.
And there will be differing levels too of, I guess, support that you'll get from an auspice. I know at a community level, like a lot of neighbourhood houses, for instance, will, going for, say, a council community grant, they'll auspice that on behalf of like maybe a couple of creative individuals who are wanting to, for example, put on a workshop or something, and so they're wanting to apply for funding, don't have any kind of sole trader or otherwise set up, and really don't want to go down the path of setting up another not-for-profit because they're only going to do this one-off thing, or they just want to dip their toes in the water. So maybe going to somewhere like a local neighbourhood house and saying, can you auspice us for this project?
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of times they may not even charge you.
No, if you're lucky.
All right.
So say that I'm knowledgeable, but I'm not a lawyer. So that
yes.
I want to put that disclaimer out there, and that there's a lot of information online when people are making decisions about this kind of stuff. So I feel like this is an introductory.
Yes.
Familiar.
To be very, very broad. Yeah. Not specific legal and or financial advice.
That was our discllaimer.
There's a lot of people out there who can do that.
Yeah, exactly. And there's an awful lot of information online. I think the business, what's it called? Victorian Business. No, I didn't save the link, but it's really helpful. I think it's business.vic.gov.au has a lot of information about that. And then I guess just to round out this bit of the conversation is that a partnership is, like, the word partner is used very broadly, and so it's always worth providing some context, because if you and I form a partnership effectively to say we want to do something put on a show together, we will each be like individual sole traders working with each other, but we're holding ourselves out as an arrangement, and so we will each be liable for the other's debts in putting on that project. So financially it's quite a high risk structure, and so when you're talking about partnering with people, it's worth being really clear. And I know everyone's going to go to those blah terms in the back of the contract that people tend to skim over, but there's usually something there that says no partnership, which is a really specific element, so that you're being really clear that by working with someone, you're asking them to provide services or you're retaining them to provide services, but you're not going to be liable for any commitments that they make on your behalf, that there's not a partnership and they're not entitled to commit your organisation to any debts or other matters on your behalf. So it's kind of worth avoiding a partnership unless you're a gigantic accounting or consulting firm, and they work in partnerships because of the way that's sort of historical and sort of a way of being able to also earn money from the surplus that the whole partnership earns. But I don't think it's that great of an idea to hold yourself out as a partnership, and certainly if you're starting to make any money, be really clear that you're not a partnership.
How would you define that otherwise? Just a collaborative relationship?
Yeah, look, I think a collaborative relationship, network, providing services. Like if you drill down into it, like if you were, a couple of sole traders working together, you just figure out a way of describing yourselves that isn't, the arty-farty partnership. It's us, a collaboration, us, a cooperative, us, a company, so that it's very clear all the way through that you're not responsible for each other's debts.
Okay, so coming back to setting up your not-for-profit incorporated association, you will be also establishing a constitution, and most organisations adopt the model rules, which have already been developed for you, which is handy. What do they cover?
So I guess the constitution of the company is the rule book of the company, and quite often at the start of when you get together, you'll set out what your purpose is and who you want to belong and all of those sorts of things. And what a lot of companies now do is just use the straightforward constitution, which is called the model rules, that have been developed by experts in this matter. Sometimes people will also want to add their own specializations. Say they particularly want to be able to only take members of a particular kind or location or age group or whatever. So there is some flexibility there. But the benefit of using the model rules is that when there are changes in the way that the rest of the corporate framework is put together, they flow through to the model rules. So there was a change at the end of last year that particularly addressed flexible use of technology, for example. So RAV had to have a constitutional change drafted by lawyers to allow for online annual general meetings and membership applications, whereas if RAV had just been using the model rules, then that would flow through automatically, because you just say, oh, well, our constitution are the model rules, and so that legislation changes, that gets allowed. So it really depends on your level of sort of sophistication and the resources you want to put into crafting your very own special constitution versus using the model rules and keeping up with contemporary changes. I think there's been questions from people using the resource that we're developing here about keeping members or committee members up to task and providing them with goals and some structure. And that's in the same changes at the end of last year came through with ways of carrying out disciplinary proceedings for committee members. There's also a bit more structure around what the responsibilities are of committee members, and stronger disclosure requirements. So, really having a very strong set of rules around conflict of interest, which can be really difficult, particularly in a small community. And you'll find someone's on several committees, and whereas in acting in their appropriate fiduciary duty to the company, when they're sitting in a meeting for a particular company, their decisions have to be for the benefit of that company. They can't be considering their own personal benefit or the benefit of another company, and they're going to that committee meeting next week or whatever. So having some really good structure around managing conflicts of interest is really important. The other, or I guess the final thing in that that sort of set of changes was a dispute resolution process. And I think people being people, there's probably going to be a dispute somewhere along the line. And so if you're going to develop your own constitution, thinking up how you're going to resolve a conflict is a really good idea, but that the model rules actually sets out a dispute resolution process around the members being entitled to call a committee meeting to consider any issues that are raised, that the members might have an absolute right to be able to do that. And that's described quite in a lot of detail on the Victorian Government's consumer.vic.gov.au resources around incorporated associations. It's really great info.
Right. And with all of those dispute resolutions, that's purely within the membership base?
Yeah, and if you've got a dispute with the neighbours, you need to figure out, well, there's probably going to be a dispute resolution process that you can use from the local council, but going to VCAT is a dispute resolution approach that you could take if you really wanted to. Yeah. But having an internal process, like a grievance process in an employment situation, there's someone that you can take your concern to. They're obligated to listen carefully to that and respond in a particular way. And if you have something in the constitution of your organisation, when you become a member, you're sort of signing up to a simple way of resolving issues, but also to a more complicated way if the small ways can't do it. So it might be something like you'll abide by the decision of someone that you pick, someone that the committee picks, and an outside person that you both think is okay. So you might, have a respected person in the community, someone that you think is sensible that you would nominate, and someone, maybe a committee member sitting, and they will decide it. And if they can resolve it, that's fantastic. It's much less expensive. It's faster. It's more within community control. I suppose the further you get into the legal system, the less control and more expenses involved.
Yeah. And is there any obligation to have, have those rules or your constitution publicly available, or do they just need to be made available to your members on joining, or what's the best practice around that?
The best practice is to make it readily available, and it certainly needs to be on the appropriate regulatory body's website along with your financial reports. So, for example, RAV has its constitution on the ACNC website, which is the Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission website, and that's part of the part of your obligations when you're registering your company, that you have to be able to provide your constitution.
Right. What's the other question I was going to ask around that? It was related to that. I guess the reason why I said, what's the best practice around making that available, because if they're the rules by which you run, when you're actually trying to recruit new committee members, then I guess it's really important to have that available so they know what they're signing up for one.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
that that's sitting alongside what I guess you're going back to what we were talking about last week with what your vision is, you know, short, long term. So which brings us to the whole succession planning. And like, would there be particular ways of like going about that, like that you'd recommend, like going out into the community, or, you know, like should you always be on the lookout? Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think, and I'm not alone, but I'm definitely, you know, there are other opinions, but I think it's good practice always to have committee succession or board succession as a standing item on an agenda, so that even if you don't dive right into it at every meeting, it is something that's front of mind at meetings and so on. I think that quite a few not-for-profits who have used the model rules and then enhanced them, or have an internal policy governing this kind of thing, will articulate what kinds of people they would like to have on their board in terms of expertise, or on their committee. So they might say that they would like someone, you know, that, well, everybody on the committee has to understand the finances. It's not just everybody looking at, you know, the treasurer and going, is it okay? Like, everybody needs to be across that, but having a qualified accountant, someone who's really experienced in marketing. If it's an organisation that wants to interact with schools, having someone who's a teacher or has some experience in the education area, all that sort of thing allows you to actually say, okay, I'm an artist, I know what a curator is. I want, you know, say 7, 9 people who are going to bring their expertise. I've got some diversity, because better decisions are made in a group that doesn't all think the same about everything. So, you know, mix of age groups, mix of genders, mix of culture, and looking at your board through that lens pretty regularly, so that, you know, if you're unicorn lawyer who plays the trumpet and is really good at this, leaves the board, that you're not then looking for another unicorn. You're actually always saying, oh, well, so-and-so's been on the board for 5 or 6 years now. They might be moving on. Maybe we should ask them to ask their friends if there's someone available, or that, you know, there's someone who's offered. Maybe we should ask them to come to a few meetings as an observer to see whether it might be something they'd like, just to kind of keep reviewing the skills and the personal attributes, and then also making sure that there's a sort of an outer usual suspects, friends kind of situation, so that you're not really floundering. You know, the only person with any accounting qualifications has to move into state for a job and can't do it anymore, that you're not really stuck. So that kind of ongoing, it is an ongoing thing. And sometimes there might be a, you know, real sort of recruitment drive if you know that there are a few people that are nearing the end of their term or the length of their interest. And then at other times it might be, you know, it might seem very stable, but I suspect that when it's the most stable is when it's a good time to start looking, because then there's people there for when it changes.
And is that something that you'd build informally, or would you, like, say, all of those things you were talking about, like the intention to always have like diversity on your board, that, you know, or even things like, if you've got, or this might be completely separate, if you've decided that the best way to keep people engaged, or the best way to actually recruit people, might be setting terms on the time that they actually need to be on the committee or are in that role. So would that need to go into the Constitution, or is that just part of how you manage things?
I know it's good to have it as part of the Constitution, although sometimes if you have gone with the model rules and you want to make some things that are very particular to your company, you might have an internal policy or terms of reference document. So, for example, if you were a group who served a particular or wanted to make art around a particular theme, you might want to say something like someone with lived experience in that theme is always on the board, or something, you know, just something like that. So the way of finding those people is not always easy peasy, and you'll quite often see on LinkedIn or some of the not-for-profit websites ads for not-for-profit board directors that will set out, you know, really specific skills that they're looking for, and that's certainly one way of doing it. Although it can also be, you know, inefficient, because I'm not sure that someone who's got really particular skills or cultural background would feel all that excited about just answering an ad blind. And so it depends, you know, it's like any other kind of employment situation. If people don't feel comfortable with the organisation, then they're not applied for an ad. So it may be that there's an ad, but there's also reaching out to people and bringing them into the fold and talking about the organisation a bit would be good.
Yeah. So the more detail you have about the type of organisation you're running, you know, and all of those things that we talked about in the strategy discussion last week, like all of those values, and plus, like, it's probably also worth mentioning, you know, or having like a resource that says, okay, this is what we're about. These are the resources we're looking after. Like, we've got, you know, a gallery space, or, you know, this, that, and the other, you know, this is what we're managing. And and then I guess too, having something like, not a huge like 2-page position description, but give a basic idea of what commitment you're making, like, you know, so, you know, this is what we're expecting of you in terms of skills, or you know, the contacts you have in the community, or whatever that is. Get together and try to define what kind of person you're looking for those roles. So when you're actually going out to look, it's quite clear to the people who are thinking about it. They don't have to ask 5 different people, you know, what that organisation's like.
Yeah, and as your sort of journey continues, collecting that stuff into something that is like aligned with an induction kit sort of situation is great, because it will set out the purpose and, you know, how often the committee meets, and then having a really open chat about the culture of the committee, and being able to say, we do not accept raised voices. We're all about passion, but we're also about respect, like whatever the values of the organisation are. And it comes back to that sort of purpose conversation that we were having a week or so ago, just about being able to say, this is how we roll, because I think that quite often when people feel very strongly about things, that there might be a few wines at a meeting. It might be quite late at night. You know, tempers can really fray, and being able to actually know that someone was really clearly briefed that poor behaviour in committee meetings won't be tolerated, and also that long meetings won't be tolerated, that they're going to be efficient, that volunteers are respected, their time's respected. It won't be a long meeting. The chair's got some experience in making sure that everybody's heard. You know, that kind of stuff, I think, is really much more tempting for someone to join.
Yes, and retaining people too. I had a really good suggestion today about sharing the chairing of meeting duties around. So rather than, you know, or even taking minutes, you know, like just sharing those duties around, so it doesn't come down to the one person each time.
Yeah. I think that's really good skill building. I mean, we do it internally, even in our staff situation of having different people facilitating our staff meetings. And I think, you know, some people get terribly nervous and other people are very confident, and being able to learn what styles people have, and also what people will dwell on that will be different, and that's actually, like diversity, really good for good decision making, that you'll get different insights into the organisation.
Yeah, makes it a different kind of conversation. Yeah. Well, I think we've covered pretty much everything.
Excellent.